Can you hear me, everybody? It just goes to show that guest speakers are more expendable than musicians. Aaron's waving at me back there saying, you're saying all the wrong things, he said. I suggested that, as we had a bit of spare time and nothing to do, this talk is about the Heroes of Telemark. I noticed that on our movie program, we've got the full movie. So I thought, well, I'll do a talk about the Heroes of Telemark because it's a Norwegian story. It's the heritage of the Vikings writ large in the 20th century, the way the men behaved. But it's also an interesting myth to dispel, because how many of you have seen the Heroes of Telemark film 1969, I think it was? Okay. Well, this is how it went. Get some sound. Should have sound on that. There we go.
The Heroes of Telemark. A love story torn straight from the pages of real life. The Heroes of Telemark. A picture of terrifying suspense against a panorama of rugged grandeur. The Heroes of Telemark. Kirk Douglas, Richard Harris, Ulla Jacobson, Michael Redgrave. Their mission, stop the Nazis from developing the atom bomb.
There you have it. You don't need anything else. It's all there. You can see it. There's a love story, soldiers, all sorts of nasty people. Johan Ronnenberg, the leader of the raid that actually took place, gave an interview, age 90, to the Daily Telegraph in London, the London Daily Telegraph, in May 2010. He referred to the film as, quote, a hopeless portrayal. They took a true story and spun their own idea around it. It should never have been allowed. And the sad thing about it was that Hollywood asked these guys that actually took part to be their technical advisors. And then they took no notice of them at all. Let's start the story from the beginning. 1939, this man, Albert Einstein, sent a typed letter, personally signed, to Franklin Delano Roosevelt personally, to the President of the United States. And it was a warning. And he said in his letter, it may be possible to set up a nuclear chain reaction in a large mass of uranium by which the vast amount of power and large quantities of new radium-like elements would be generated. This could be achieved in the near future. This new phenomenon would lead to the construction of bombs, and it is conceivable that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed. A single bomb of this type carried by a boat and exploded in a port might well destroy the whole port together with some of the surrounding territory. August 1939. Now, the reason that Albert Einstein could say that was because German scientists had split the atom in Germany in 1936. So the potential of an atomic weapon, as well as atomic generation of power and other things, to the scientists was plainly obvious. The great thing, as far as we're concerned, in the free world today is that Hitler had expelled most of his greatest physicists because they were Jewish. He'd either expelled them or they had left of their own accord or paid to leave. And very few German scientists of any great skill, compared to the ones that went to the Manhattan Project, the Allied project, were left in Germany. But that didn't stop them. It starts with this place. You saw a black and white photograph of it wartime. This is a contemporary photograph. I've been to this. I had the pleasure, while I was a museum director for 10 years, of being the president of the International Association of Transport and Communications Museums. And one of the annual conferences was in Norway. And I knew this story, and I said, is it possible for us to go to the hydroelectric Nordsk Hydro plant at Ukjen, near Vemork, on the top of the Hardanger Plateau, just north of Bergen? And they said, well, it's not easy to get to, but we'll take you there, and that's the place, and that's what I wanted to go to. It's like a huge James Bond set. But when I got there, in those days, I took one look, and I said to my guides, what's the point of generating electricity this far from anybody who might need it? And then I was told, because I'm stupid like that, I was told, actually, we don't need it to put light bulbs on or power our TVs or our refrigerators or whatever. Only 6% of Norwegian land is croppable. When you think about Norway, most of the green grass, the croppable land, is right by the edge of the fields. The rest of the country is very, very sparse, mountainous. There's a tree line and so on. So they have to crop their small fields 2 or 3 times a year in order to provide the food for their cattle during the summer and the silage for their cattle during the winter. So they're deeply into fertilizer. Not that deeply, but they're deeply into fertilizer. So they need potassium, they need electrolysis to produce phosphates in order to spread it on their land. So Nordsk Hydro's purpose is to draw that water from the mountain at the top, from a lake in the mountain at the top. I'm not going to do any gesturing because I might end up flat on my back. That lake at the top of the mountain there, down through the power plant, and turn phosphates into fertilizer through electrolysis. The byproduct of doing that is an element called deuterium oxide. Any physicists in the audience? Oh dear, we've got one. I'll show my ignorance now then. Deuterium oxide is one of 2 stabilizing elements in the enrichment process of uranium, which will eventually lead you to plutonium, but you can make a uranium bomb or a plutonium bomb. The other one is carbon, but the processes were quite well known at the time. The exact way of doing it wasn't that well known, it was all experimentation. But as far as the Germans were concerned, they had access as a result of them capturing Norway or invading Norway in April 1940. They had access to the production of deuterium oxide, which was a byproduct made at the Nordsk Hydro factory. The trouble was it was made in extremely small quantities because it was purely a byproduct of the electrolysis process for making the fertilizer. But it was what's known as a neutron moderator, and it was essential to the way in which the Germans thought that they would create a weapon from their atomic research. And we knew all about it because Professor Leif Tronstadt was the person who built the Nordsk Hydro plant, and he escaped to England when Norway was invaded and joined the Special Operations Executive, the organization that was supposed to set Europe afire, according to Winston Churchill. And he immediately made his knowledge of what this plant did and why the Germans were so interested in it to our intelligence services. Even better than that is Einar Skinnerland, a real character. He was 24 years old. He was an engineer at the plant. And he decides that he's going to take a holiday, and he goes to his boss at the plant and says, "Could I have my 2 weeks annual leave, please?" And his boss says, "Yeah, sure." He said, "Where are you going to go?" He said, "I'm going to go do a bit of hiking." Anyway, what he does is, with a couple of friends, he goes and hijacks a fishing boat and sails it to Scotland. He arrives in Scotland, and they say, "Well, who are you?" And he said, "My name's Einar Skinnerland." He said, "Where do you work?" He said, I work as a manager in the Nordsk Hydro plant at Vemork." "Come with us," they said. They trained him to drop back into Norway by parachute and to operate wireless within that 2 weeks of his holiday. And at the end of his holiday, he returned to work, and his manager said, "Did you have a good time?" He said, "Oh, yes, did a bit of skiing, a bit of hunting, a bit of fishing. I had a lovely time, thank you." In 2 weeks, they trained him to be a wireless operator and an intelligence officer. And he spent the rest of the war giving intelligence to our side as to what the production of deuterium oxide was in that plant. And he was the direct contact with the saboteurs who eventually destroyed it. And it was all coordinated by our MI6, the equivalent of the American CIA. And the intelligence was extremely important. And this is another young man. At the time, he was only in his 20s too, but he was one of the government's chief scientific advisors, R.V. Jones. I don't know whether you can see in this clip, I knew Sir Robert Jones quite well when he was alive. He's dead now. He used to wear a watch on both hands. I think one was on GMT all the time and one was wherever he was in the world. But anyway, this is him talking about how they discovered what they would do with the deuterium oxide.
It was a completely, as it were, Bakshi signal from Norway that came into the headquarters of MI6, and it went round the office and finally came to me because I was the one scientist, almost the one scientist there, and it said that the Germans were increasing their heavy water production at Rjukan in Norway. And immediately I started inquiries to the origin of the telegram, and it happened the head of the Norwegian section, when I sent for him, he said he wants to hear about this telegram. It's a bloody silly telegram. Who ever heard of such a thing as heavy water? And I said, now don't you laugh. You see, this is really quite serious. And he immediately picked up the point. And so we then sent a signal saying, yes, we would like to know everything possible about German interest in Rjukan. And then, to my, afterwards delight, we had this marvelous signal come back saying, yes, the Norwegians would tell us more. They'd do everything they could, provided they had one assurance from us that ICI was not at the bottom of this inquiry. Because, said the telegram, remember this was a telegram sent under conditions of resistance during the war, remember, blood is thicker even than heavy water.
They were frightened that ICI, their big competitor, was going to get their secrets. So where is it? It's on a pretty forbidding place. How many of you have been to Bergen? Yes, and up the fjord to the Hardanger at the very end of the fjord behind. It's a pretty nice place in the summer, and it's not bad looking in the winter, providing you're at sea level. But it is, in fact, a 3,500 square mile scaled up version of the worst place in the world. In the Arctic with an attitude is what they call it. It's too harsh for vegetation. It's an uninhabited wilderness of rocks, lakes and streams. Reindeer, grouse and snow foxes only at certain times of the year. Otherwise it is completely desolate. Humans go up there at their peril in the winter. And the Germans during the Second World War never spent a single night on the Hardangervidda, the Hardanger Plateau. And NATO now train its troops in Arctic warfare up there, and they don't let them stay up there very long either. Often there's a wind chill of minus 30 degrees centigrade at the top there. What we decided to do is we decided that we would send an initial reconnaissance group in of Norwegians, and then we would send British engineers and commandos in by glider to destroy this plant. So the first group that went in were codenamed, first of all, Grouse, and then they changed the name to Swallow. And they went in on the 18th of October 1942. As I've said, good old Einar Skinnerland had already gone back off his holiday, and he was in there to do the intelligence. But they were dropped by parachute 700,000 feet up, and that's the list of who they were. Jens Hansel Poulsen, who was their leader, Knut Hauglid, who you will see a bit of later, Arne Kjelstrup, and Claus Helberg, who we'll also talk about as well. And their job was to, if you like, receive the gliders when they came in with the troops that were going to assault. And the plan was that the commandos and the engineers would assault the factory, the hydroelectric plant, destroy it, and that then they would try and get out through Sweden. It was really a bit of a suicide mission, really, and they called it Operation Freshman. And on the night of the 19th, 20th of November 1942, two Halifaxes towing two gliders lifted men from the Royal Engineers Airborne Regiment, 4 glider pilots, into the area and tried to drop them onto the Hardangervidda to be met by this advance party. Sadly, and that's what a Halifax and a Horsa glider looks like. Sadly, both the gliders had a mishap. Only one of the aircraft got home, and that was one of the Halifaxes. The conditions were appalling. Icing was terrible. One of the first one, DP349, broke loose in icing. 8 men were killed in the crash. 5 men were shot by the Germans, and then 4 men were murdered by the Germans. There's a distinct difference. Actually, a German doctor actually injected water into the 4 men's arteries in order to kill them. They tortured them. This was after Hitler had issued his commando order that all commandos would be would be summarily executed. But this particular group of German soldiers, I'm afraid, went to great lengths to do it in the cruelest possible way. That's the site in summer of where the Horsa crashed. Operation Freshman's second team, 3 men were killed in the crash, 14 men were shot and left in the snow. They were also tortured before they were killed. A number of them were wounded before they were shot. Unfortunately, one of the officers had on his person a complete plan of what they were going to do. So the Germans were immediately made aware that the plant at Rücken was the target, and that the British knew that they were doing what they were doing there and why they were doing it, and that it was therefore more vulnerable. So as a result of this operation, I'm afraid the Germans increased the number of guards and the way in which they were going to stop anything happening at that particular plant. The people that were on that raid are still remembered in Norway today. They're honoured every year. You can see the memorial there. Children put flowers in front of their memorial every year, and the perpetrators of the crimes that were left at the end of the war were tried at the Nuremberg war trials. So the Grouse and Swallow group, which had landed in order to help the Operation Freshman, the glider pilots, are now stranded. On top of the Hardangervidda, they were supposed to stay there for about a month, and they were supplied with provisions for a month. They landed in the worst winter on record, and they landed in a part of the Hardangervidda that was not where they were supposed to. They were 20 miles away from where they should have been. And also when they landed, one of their containers with their equipment got smashed, and inside it was their Primus stove, the thing they needed to heat any food or any water. What they did was they went to a BO, a B-O with a mouse on top, which is a hut. And up on the plateau, Norwegian men, huntsmen, outdoorsmen, build little wooden huts and dot them about, and they always have their name and then the name, the word hut. So they went to a hut called Svenbo, which obviously was Sven's hut, and usually inside the huts there were a few things that were left by the person who owned it or the last person who used it. And this is the same for any wild and wilderness place, particularly cold in the world. You'll have it in Canada and in parts of the United States. We even have it in parts of Scotland and Wales. You leave the place as you find it. You have to usually break into it in some way, but you seal it up when you leave it. Anyway, they found a small hut. And they spent, these 5 men, they spent the whole winter, not just a month, they spent from October to February in this hut without any provisions after they'd used up their month's supply. And they were, of course, at risk of all sorts of things: starvation, discovery by the Germans. They couldn't communicate. The batteries in their radios wouldn't work. They couldn't communicate with anybody. They couldn't tell London what they'd been doing. And there was this risk, too, of polar sickness. But their leader, Jens Anton Poulsen, is cited as being one of the greatest sabotage leaders of all time, because he kept these men alive for this period by all sorts of ways that would not necessarily occur to all of us. Every evening, each one of them in Civvy Street, in civilian lives, had a different profession. So he told them that they should all, by the time that they were finished there, they should all know as much about each other's work and their skills as everybody else. So one of them was a plumber. So by the time they finished, they were all plumbers. One of them was an electrician. So by the time they finished, they all knew about wiring homes and plants and all that sort of stuff. A couple of them were academics, so they passed on their academic knowledge and so on. So every night there was a formal lecture by one of them to the others. And he kept their spirits up. And it wasn't until Christmas time, December, the end of December, Poulsen used to go out every day. They had with a hunting rifle. He was a great huntsman before he joined SOE, with a hunting rifle, waiting for the reindeer to come to where they were, because they were seasonal animals, waiting for the migration. And it was Christmas Eve, he actually shot a reindeer. That was the first meat they'd had since October. And by then they were getting very close to scurvy as well, because there's no vitamin C at that part of the world. So what they did was they ate the grass out of the stomach of the reindeer in order to provide themselves with vitamin C. And of course they ate the reindeer and had what they considered to be something of a feast on Christmas Eve. And they decorated their hut as well with decorations. And they found a small scrap of a tree that looked like a Christmas tree, and they brought it into the hut. But the whole recruitment of men like this in the Special Operations Executive in England was very, very carefully planned. And they all had to go through a process. And of course, all of them were in the main, very young men, very fit. So women had quite an important role in the Special Operations Executive. Those that went into an operational area, because they were sometimes civilians and sometimes in the military, but all that went into operational areas, into enemy territory, were given military ranks, military status, in order to try and protect them under the Geneva Convention. It didn't really work, because most of them were secret agents, spies, but in the context of this story, and they're listed on the left of the right of that slide, or left as you look at it. They were spies or operators of radios in France and all occupied Europe, couriers and agents. But the ones that are relevant to our story are the ones that stayed behind in England. We had most of our wireless operators were women. Morse code, of course, was the method at the time. And they would get to know the agents who were wireless operators, in this case, in Norway. And if the wireless operator was sending a message, it would have to be very quick and in code and in short chunks. And they would use the same women to communicate with the same agents on the other side, because they would recognize their hand, as they called it, the way they operated the keys. So it was very much a job of intuition done by women at various places in the UK. One of them's a huge prison now, which people from Britain often wonder how a radio station could become a prison. But I put in inverted commas there at the bottom for this operation and any other operation where agents were being dropped into occupied territory. The SOE provided hostesses. These were very charming young ladies, usually from a pretty upper-class background, who were meant to look after the young men in the week or two before they were sent on operations. Not in any sexual way or anything like that, just to what they were actually doing, they were checking them. So they would go and have a drink with them, they would go and dance at a nightclub, or they would take them to the movies or whatever. And if any of those young men started to behave indiscreetly about what he was going to do and tell them anything about what he did as an SOE agent, they would immediately report back, and that guy would never go anywhere. They were checking on the robustness of their ability to say nothing and appear to be something they weren't. And of course, the best way to do that of any young man is to put him in some situation where he wants to impress a young lady. So that's how they used them, and they were very, very successful. The Gunnerside group is the next lot. These are the support group that are going in now. The whole mission has changed because the original mission failed. The gliders were shot down. So now a whole group are going to go in, and they're going to meet up with the starting group. And they're called Gunnerside. That's their code name. That's actually an estate in Scotland where they trained, the Gunnerside estate in Scotland. They were again dropped by parachute, but they were dropped in the wrong place as well. I mean, we're talking about a featureless plateau, which is from the air just white, but they were dropped in the wrong place. It took them a week of searching until they found their colleagues, and then they started to plan, and the characters in the second group are listed on the right-hand side there. They started to plan to raid the factory. And the first attack they did was on the 27th, night of 27th, 28th February 1943. They looked and they sent, their camp was about 25 miles from the plant. But as you saw in the photograph of the plant, it was on the side of a hill, and in front of it was a huge gorge. Any mountaineers amongst us, or ex-mountaineers? Mountaineers grade the level of the difficulty of mountains and climbs on a scale of something like 1 to 10 or whatever. And I can't remember what the actual scale is, but say 1 is the sort of thing I could just about manage, and 10 is the sort of thing that I'd get nowhere near. This climb into this gorge and back out again is classed as a 10. Nobody had ever done it before, therefore the Germans weren't guarding it. They had a bridge over the ravine, but they didn't have any guards on either side. Anyway, they scouted it out. One man went, a chap called Claus Helberg, we'll see in a moment. He went down at night, up the other side, found a way, came back and told the others, and the first attack was planned. And this is Knut Hauglid and Joachim Runenberg talking about the first attack.
The explosion itself was not very loud at all. It was, should say, like 2 or 3 cars crashing together on Piccadilly Circus.
It was rather an anticlimax because we have been waiting for half a year nearly for this bang, and it wasn't very impressive. We had the English password, Piccadilly Circus, and the answer Leicester Square. And I remember when we got outside the gate, we heard a voice saying Piccadilly Circus, and I got the answer, shut up.
So the answer to the code word was shut up, not the right answer. They left a British Sten gun behind. You just saw it at the very end of the clip there. They were dressed in British Army uniforms. They didn't want reprisals to happen to the Norwegian population if the Germans knew that it was Norwegians attacking the plant. So everything they did was done as though they were Brits. And they left a British weapon there. They spoke in English and they wore British uniforms. This is a recreation that's actually at the plant today. If you went there, they've got a tiny museum. What it shows in the background is the poor old caretaker who was in the plant at the time, who was, of course, a Norwegian. They didn't want to kill him. And he was quite amenable to them destroying it, as he would be. They had guns. So they tied him up, and they made it look like they roughed him up as well. But he wasn't. He was quite old. As they set the fuses going, they ran back to leave. He cried out to them and said, "I've lost my glasses, spectacles." And in wartime in Norway, it was not easy to get spectacles. And they knew that, so they went back into the place they'd just set the charges for and rummaged around for about 5 or 10 minutes and found his spectacles and gave them back to him. They then left and they blew up the heavy water plant. And as you heard Knut say, it was a very quiet explosion. The Germans didn't hear it. They had no idea it had happened. They got away without anybody knowing. All they did was they found that the place had been destroyed, and they didn't know who'd done it. They assumed it was the Brits, the commandos, but they had no idea. They went back down the ravine up the other side, and they went back to Svenbo there, the hut. And then they dispersed and made their way to various places, primarily to Sweden. This fellow, Claus Helberg, he, in civilian life, was a mountain guide. He's the chap who went down the ravine and found the path. He actually, after the first attack, decided he would stay in Norway and go to Sweden first, then come back and fight in the resistance. And he had one heck of a journey across the Hardangervidda on skis. He was an alpine ski racing champion. He could go very fast. But he actually managed to escape. This is him talking.
I went out as quickly as I could. I took on my skis in a second or two and ran away as fast as I could. And the Germans, they hadn't managed to surround me. So it was an open gap I could get through. I was a little, not very scared, but I thought, well, this is the end for me. But in a way, I was glad that we had succeeded at Telemark.
They chased him for 6 hours. And as he got further and further across the plateau, the Germans slowly, one by one, stopped following him because they got worn out. And eventually there was just 2 German soldiers skiing behind him. One fell out, and the final one was faster than him on the downhill and slower than him on the uphill. But they were slowly, the gap was getting slower. Anyway, Claus in the end, decides that he's had enough of this, so he waits at the top of the hill till the chap appears, turns around, shoots him, and then carries on skiing. He eventually gets into a hotel and books a room, stays in the hotel. Turns out it's the hotel where the local Gauleiter of the whole of Norway is going to be staying that night, and they commandeer all the rooms. And Claus and a young girl that he hadn't met before are looked upon as being suspicious, so they're taken away by the German authorities, the field police, in a bus with all the other residents of the hotel. But these 2 were rude about the Gauleiter taking all their rooms. So he's in this bus, Claus Helberg, with this young lady, and he escapes from the bus, gets shot at by the guards in the arm, and still manages to escape, and gets back into Sweden, and then goes back into Norway and carries on fighting for the rest of the war. Knut Hauglid gives a very good account of why the Germans didn't catch any of them.
The Germans couldn't find us because they used too many men to hunt just for 2 men. As far as we could find out later on, they had used up to 10,000 men. And 10,000 men running around in the Norwegian mountains looking for 2, just can't find them. The 2 opposing forces are too unequal. They make too many tracks and they get more or less out of control. There is only one way to find people in the wilderness. This goes not only for Norway, but every place in the whole world. You've got to hunt them the same way in which they live.
Both Hauglid and Ronenberg, you saw Ronenberg in uniform in an earlier clip, stayed on in the Norwegian army. And of course they were not only revered for what they'd done, but they became part of the training scheme for NATO troops training in Arctic conditions. Anyway, as a result of this attack, the Germans decided to up the production of heavy water. And Skinnerland, who's inside the plant, notifies Britain that this is going on. And for some time, particularly the Brits had been saying, we'll bomb it, because we love bombing anything that moves, really. But because it was perceived that we were relatively inaccurate compared to the United States 8th Army Air Force, and they were very accurate because they had what was called the Norden bomb sight, which could hit a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet, we would let the Americans have a go. But the point why they didn't want it attacked by the air was the civilian casualties. They didn't want any civilian casualties. They hadn't throughout the attempts on the plant. But there was an air attack, and it was done by B-17s, and there's a photograph of Rjukan itself, the town. But 300 B-17s attacked it, went to find it. 162 found it and attacked it. And from 12,000 feet, they dropped 912 bombs. And that precision bombing of hitting a pickle barrel, they managed to get 18 bombs on the target. Unfortunately, 22 Norwegians were killed in the 45-minute raid. And sadly, 2 crews were lost from the B-17s. But only 60 kilograms of heavy water destroyed. The Germans then decided, right, this place is now too vulnerable. We're going to move the whole stock of heavy water out of the Rjukan in Norway. We're going to move it back to Germany. And of course, the intelligence came straight out of Rjukan back to England. They're going to move it. And these are the dates and times and so on. And in the film, you can see them moving it with the man falling off. There's the ferry, an actual picture of the ferry, which is why it's so blurred. It's a contemporary black and white photograph of the Nordsk Hydro. And Knut Hauglid, the man you just saw, he is charged with blowing this ferry up. Just like that, you just go and blow the ferry up. They had no explosives, they had no timing devices. He made the timing devices out of Do you remember the old alarm clocks with the 2 bells on the top? He made the timing device out of those, and because of the lecture he'd received in Svenbo, he was a pretty good electrician. So he made the timing device from the bell. When it clattered, it made the contact, and that blew up the explosives, and the explosives were acquired from airdrops and things like that. So he managed to get onto the ferry. The Germans didn't guard the ferry. They guarded the railway track and everything to the ferry, but they didn't, because they were going to take the railway cars containing the tins of heavy water onto the railway track. They didn't guard the actual ferry. He got on board, he got inside it, he placed the charges.
We just walked aboard the ferry in the middle of the night, got around the Norwegian watchman who was there, and went down into the bilges and lay the delayed charge which would sink the ferry. What we had to do was to lay the charge in the bottom of the boat in such a way that it would blow out 2 square meters of the bottom.
Makes it sound very easy. It's not very easy at all, and he placed it perfectly. This is the captain of the ferry who was sailing it at the time. This is the more modern ferry.
About 10:30, I was on the bridge then at that time, and I heard a explosion down in the ship, and I understand what it was at once. I think it was a bomb. The ship started to went over to the port side, and after a few minutes, this ferry was laying flat. I could walk on the ship's side like a floor, and then I got my clothes off and all, but I forgot to take the boots off. And so when she sank, was only 1 meter again, I think, then I jumped in the water. And I swim for about 15 feet from the ship, and I go around and look at the ship, and then she went down.
3,600 gallons of deuterium oxide at the bottom of the lake, which is 400 meters down. A couple of them rose to the surface, giving conspiracy theorists the thought that perhaps they weren't all full. And in fact, one was recovered a couple of years ago, and it was found that some of them just weren't fully filled. But when they got the water out, I mean, you can drink heavy water, it looks exactly the same. When it was tested, it was found that it was deuterium oxide. And sadly, 14 Norwegian passengers on the ferry were killed and 4 Germans died. But in fact, by doing that, we think that the world had been saved from having an atomic bomb made by the Germans. This is a group photograph of them when they all got back. Sadly, Leif Tronstad, in the middle, their leader, was killed. He was betrayed by a Norwegian quisling later in the war, and he was killed, but the rest of them all survived. But 2 questions remain. Has the story been properly told? Well, I've certainly tried. And did Hitler have an atomic bomb program? The answer to the first one is that another film has been made, and if it ever you may have seen it. It was a series on television called The Saboteurs. It was made in 2015. It's a mini-series. It was partially correct, but again, I'm afraid that Anna Friel on the right there is improperly dressed, and all sorts of stuff is wrong about that photograph. But Leif Tronstad is portrayed on the left there by Eppen Hune, but only his role in it is really correct. But it's actually quite well done. Did the bomb exist? Well, there's controversy about this today because Hitler had created an environment where if you were a senior physicist and Jewish, you would not want to stay in his country. And also he believed that he would win the war so quickly that he didn't need any strategic weapons. There's a controversy still to this day as to how far they got with it. But this is an original German drawing of their bomb. But the political and ideological prejudices of the Nazis, their racial code and all that sort of thing, anything that wasn't invented in Germany by an Aryan wasn't picked up by them. So there's also talk that some of the scientists may well have delayed the project knowing what would happen. There's no real proof of that, but it could be possible. But here is the German atomic pile that was found in 1945, where they were starting to make progress, but they were way behind the Manhattan Project. But he did have plans for a V3 rocket, which would have perhaps got to the United States or Moscow or London. He had always had plans for what he called the America bomber, a strategic bomber, but it had never, well, it had got to a certain stage. There were a couple flying that might have done it, made by Junkers, but they were nowhere near any sort of strategic attack. There is a CIA report on the whole of the series of sabotage raids made by these very brave men. None of them were ever found, and nobody was ever held responsible by the Germans for these acts of sabotage. The Germans had no idea who had perpetrated them. It wasn't until after the war. CIA did a complete report on it, using the men in the raid as witnesses. And you can download that from Google. If you just look at the German atomic weapons program and go to CIA, you can download the report. And they say that the most important series of sabotage raids in history. And that is the true story of the Heroes of Telemark, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for being with me.